Hello, and welcome to Getting It,
the conversation where we try to understand life just that little bit more.
My name's Dan.
And my name is Saban.
And we're both medical students based in London.
And in this episode, we're joined by Jerry, a medical student with a master's in neuroscience who also has a special interest in art. In today's episode, we discuss the universal nature of art, how it affects us, and art's position in different cultures.
Good evening. Hello, hello, Saban.
Hello, Dan. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. And
we have to ask it for a third time. Hello,
Jerry. Good evening, Jerry.
Hello. I guess you guys didn't forget about me. Thank you for that.
You're very welcome. So today on this podcast, we have a special guest. We have a good friend of ours, Jerry, and he's here to talk to us for the next hour about a very interesting topic. So before we continue, do you mind just telling us a bit about you, Jerry?
Yeah, sure. I'm Jerry, just like in Tom and Jerry, and I am an art lover.
Okay, and
that was straight to the point. I respect that.
I remember back to Thomas's episode a few episodes ago, and his introduction was very interesting. So I like your method as well. In terms of a bit of a background about you, do you mind sharing that as well?
Yeah, sure. So I love art. I do a bit too, especially visual art, like painting, drawing. I've taken part in a few small exhibitions in London too. I want to do a bit more. And I'm actually a medical student, just like Dan. We studied together.
Okay.
I also did a master's in neuroscience last year because, I have a special interest in the brain. I'm interested in psychiatry, neuroscience, all of that. I don't want to do just one. I want to do lots of different kinds of stuff. And that's quite a fundamental part of my identity, actually. I like seeing the world in different perspectives. I want to do that. Just like, those kaleidoscopes you look through as a kid. There's so many colors out there. And for me, it would be such a shame if we only look at a few of them, even if, some of the colors might be really ugly, like poo-colored or something. I guess that would be kind of the theme of today, not kaleidoscopes or nasty colors, but different perspectives. I'll talk about a few of my favorite, but those interconnected ideas of, what art really is, what it's for. And I'll let Dan, Saban, and you guys think about it a bit too. And I think whether you're a complete stranger to art or kind of an amateur enthusiast like me, or an artiste in the flesh, there will be something for you to take away here.
And I think I'm quite looking forward to this episode personally because I've known Jerry for a very long time at uni now, and it's something that Jerry's very passionate about. And as a result, I've seen he's always been showing me art pieces, or I've gone to some galleries sometimes, and I see how much meaning people can take from it. And for me, it sounds silly, but it's something I'm almost a bit intimidated to talk about sometimes because, I don't know, if you don't know anything about it, it can seem a bit confusing, or at least that's how I found it, because, I don't know what people are taking away from a certain piece of art. So, that's what I'd like to kind of figure out today, is a bit more about what to do when I look at a piece of art, or understand why people spend their whole lives making art, and what do people get from that? Why does it influence so many different cultures across the world, and how they all express themselves so differently through it? So I don't know, Saban, do you have much experience with art?
Not really, or at least what most people kind of think about when you say the word art, say classical paintings, that kind of stuff. I'm more in the realm of, or at least more experienced in, digital type of art, photography, videography, animation, that kind of stuff. So whenever it's come to the more traditional arts, I've always been a bit like, I don't really get it, or I don't really find it that interesting or that nice or anything. And for me, I always thought it was just for me in art in general. But then I realized, no, I really do like photography. And, in certain parts, I can find it really deep. But I've never had that same kind of connection with the more, classical side of art. So I think this will be quite interesting because obviously there's a lot of overlap, I guess, in terms of, why people do it, what you kind of gain from it, and why, you would go about doing a certain, like, photograph something in one way compared to the other, or, make a video in one way compared to the other and everything. So, I guess that's kind of my experience. One thing I do want to mention, I think what really changed my experience about art, because before I always thought it was like, nah, art just really isn't my thing. And that was at the time when I was really obsessed about, photography. But then, especially street photography. But then I was watching some dude talking about it, and he said, what you capture in street photography is more a reflection of yourself rather than the people you're capturing and that environment you're in.
I
And
agree.
then I started looking at my photos and I was like, okay, yeah. And then, I'm going through trying to capture these certain things within the environment in a particular way, or changing the perspective so it looks like that person is doing something else compared to what they are actually doing. So that is actually showing more of a reflection of myself or what I want the viewer of that photo to see. So, and then at that point I was like, oh, okay, maybe I am kind of into this art thing overall. So I guess that's my kind of experience with it overall.
Yeah, it's like a form of projection, isn't it? It's kind of, whenever you take a photo, there's always a bit of your own narrative in it. You can never capture an objective moment visually. The angle you're doing it in, the lighting it's in, how close it is to their face, for example. Yeah, you're always putting a part of yourself in it. And that's one of the definitions for art, I'd say. Okay, I think it'd be fun to start today with a question that everyone dreads being asked, but I quite like asking. So guys, what do you think art is?
Okay, so it's definitely a question that I don't really know how to answer it. But if I'm being forced to, then I would say it's a way that you can express yourself, whether that be an emotion or telling a story. And I don't think it has to just be a painting or a sketch. It can be music, it can be singing, it can be sound. I don't know. Just a way to express yourself and tell something about yourself or tell a story. That's how it appears to me. What about you, Saban?
Good question. I don't know, to give it like a singular definition, is that even possible? I guess it's some kind of supra-real visualization or expression of something within the real world.
Okay, that's interesting. So the answer is you're both correct. There's no right answer.
Yes.
Full marks to both
I
of
knew
you.
it.
There's very many definitions. And I want to preface first. I don't actually have a proper answer to what art is, in case you thought I did. If I did have a right answer, I'd definitely be on a bigger talk show.
Okay.
Like
Not offended.
In James Corden's backseat or something, Okay. I actually don't really like that show, but yeah. No, this is meant to be kind of exploring and discussing some of the ideas out there. Like what you said about self-expressing and what Saban said about, turning the reality around us and putting that and visualizing it. So these are two definitions of the many there are. And I'm just going to be talking about some that I particularly connect with and just some out there. Okay, so first of all, I think, Dan, you kind of mentioned that, when you go to an art gallery, you might feel like, I'm not really sure what to get from this painting. It feels like maybe other people know, so it's a bit awkward to ask or something, and that, maybe not everyone gets art. Well, I in some ways disagree with that, in the sense that I feel like art is actually a very universal concept. I don't think it's that only some people can get it, or that it requires a certain background to get it. And I'll give a few reasons why I think it's so universal. First of all, I'm asking lots of questions, but here's one more. Have you guys, even when you were young or when you're now, have you ever put your hand down onto a piece of paper and kind of traced around it?
Yes, I have. I remember doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite a natural thing, isn't it? You just take a pencil and you got your hand, you got the paper, and you just kind of want to do that. Well, we've been doing it for a very long time, for thousands and thousands of years. There are these incredible caveman paintings from all over at least 10,000 years old. There's the Petakara Cave in Indonesia. There's Lascaux Cave in France, Cueva de las Manos in Argentina, and countless more. These caves littered all around the world, created tens, 20s, 30s of thousands of years ago by our ancestors. And they all contain paintings. And interestingly, all these paintings that are thousands of miles away from each other, there's no way they could have, communicated with each other. They're almost all on the same topics, the paintings. They're almost always animals that these people live with or hunted, and their hands. You see, it's really amazing to see. I'll show you one of the photos here. So this is in the Argentinian cave, the Cueva de las Manos. And you can see there's 30, 40, 50 people or something putting their hand on the wall and imprinted there. And what I find so amazing about it is that it wasn't necessary for them to do that. I mean, as you can imagine, living on Earth thousands of years ago, it's not an easy life. You have to spend all day foraging for food, hunting, gathering things, and sharpening tools, preparing fires. It's hard to live, but despite that, they took,
Keep going, sorry.
Despite that, they took countless hours out. They crushed minerals to form pigments, and then they painted these incredibly detailed paintings. So this is just the hand stuff. There's also things like buffaloes, reindeers. And, some of the paintings on these walls are like 4 meters high up. So they had to build scaffolding and such.
And something I want to know about this, I'm not sure if you could possibly know the answer, but in terms of the intention behind doing something like that piece of art, do you think that there was probably no reason for doing it, or do you think they were trying to record something, if that makes sense, like
Completely, yes.
like a census almost, or something?
No,
like that?
I know what you mean, yes. And that's something scholars have debated a lot about. Obviously, we have no real way of knowing why our ancestors tens of thousands of years ago did all of these paintings. There are some ideas. One, they think it might be a hunting ritual, that before you go hunting, you draw your target or such like that. Could be a way of testing out these pigments, the handprints. But many of them, including me, I think it's something to do with kind of leaving your mark, kind of showing that you were there. And, it's, like we said before, it's such a natural thing. Seeing your hand and having a way of recording it and just recording it. And that's you, that's your hand. So at least the way I choose to interpret it is kind of their way of proving that we were there, This was us. And it's clearly innate to them and us.
And those were the hand one. You mentioned that they often do animals or do a human body. Are there any examples of like a sort of complex artwork in a cave or something? I don't know if that's a silly question, but was it almost always something like a human figure or an animal, or was it ever like a concept that you think that they would try and draw, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think I know what you mean. You're asking whether, what they did was just recording things they saw around them, or if they tried to express things in it.
Like do an imaginary animal or something like that.
Right. Well, again, like I said, we can never know the intention behind why they do it. It could very well be that the way they drew the animals, the people, it was to show a certain emotion. For example, we don't know the intention behind the hand marks. It could be to show, isolation. It could be showed togetherness. We don't really know. But in terms of really abstract things, like strange shapes, to my knowledge, I don't really know anything like that. But that's a very interesting question. So, this concept of a universality of art and kind of how it being innate to us, and how it might be a way for us to leave our mark, that actually ties into the way that I got into art in the first place. I thought it could be a fun story to tell. So, for the longest time, until I was about 16, 17, I've never really cared too much about art. I just thought it was kind of just like pretty things, and I thought I wasn't very good at it. I never went to art class or anything like that. But that really all changed with one experience, and it was when I went to Vienna with my then girlfriend. I went to a museum called the Leopold Museum. And I didn't really know much about what was going to happen, what I was going to see, just kind of like a thing to do on holiday. The Leopold Museum is quite special. It has one floor dedicated to just one artist, and each room is kind of a different phase of the artist's life, from when they were young and their works they did then, and a bit about their life, then when they were older, the relevant works they did, and then until their death. And the artist was Egon Schiele. And, so I got a bunch of the photos of the paintings there. And I'm going to show you guys 3 photos that really connected with me. 3 paintings.
And these will be in the show notes as well.
Yeah, so I just want to show you guys what it was like and what experience I went through. The first painting is, you see that painting of a boat. It's just quite, it's got like a city scene, like a boat. It's quite expressionistic. It was in 1907 when the artist was about 17 years old when he painted this. You can see it's very beautiful, but it's not really saying anything, if that makes sense. It was just him kind of doing art, and he was very good at it.
Like an observation.
Exactly, his way of observing and what he saw, that boat and that river. And this was him 3 years later when he was 20. A self-portrait of arm twisting above his head.
Oh, it's a lot
And you see how different it is. This is him when he was 20, and this is around the most productive period of his time. And this is the time when he became really obsessed with his own body and sex. And you can see the way he chose to paint himself. this is how he sees himself, just clearly tortured. The limbs are elongated, they're like knobbly, and the expression. You can see how much change has happened to his person between those two paintings.
So this is 3 years later.
This is 3 years later, yes.
And in the first period, in the first one in 1907, around that time, was he mainly doing landscapes and?
Yes, he was.
Okay.
Yes. So this was quite recent. So around the time he started doing lots of really haunting portraits. You see, it's a very unique style. It's so him.
And did you know anything about Egon Schiele before going in?
I knew absolutely nothing about him. Never heard of him. When I was working, I thought he had a cool name. But I was just struck by these paintings, and just because, I guess when you read a book, when you hear a story, you can learn about someone's life. But here I was seeing it. It's a very different experience altogether. And the last one, this one is The Embrace. And as you can see, it's a very romantic painting. It's him embracing his wife, who he loved very much. And you can see there's, even though it's people, like the second painting. Now this was in 1917. That's 1 year before his death, when he was about 27 years old. And here you see not really any of that torturedness we see in the last painting. Even though it was still people, it's so, kind of, for lack of a better word, like whole. It's him and his wife uniting as one, and it's such a touching embrace. And that's him then, 7 years after that second painting. Yeah.
And his body is, the proportions and everything are completely different. He looks like strong. And
so this is how he saw himself then. He's protecting the woman he loves. He's whole. He's not like thin and elongated.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And this was all chronological, right? So you were going through the museum, and you'd never heard of him before, and every room you're going into is a new year, a new part of his life. And did, again, this is probably a silly question, but did each painting have a little explanation by it that you were reading?
It did, yeah.
Okay, so you were able to actually understand what part of his life he was in at each point.
And inside each room, there was a big paragraph about what he was going through during that year and such.
And was that like an autobiography kind of thing, like from him, or someone's interpretation of it?
Oh, you mean the writing on the side?
Yeah.
Yes, I guess it's a combination. It will just be kind of like analysis of it, and also if there is any background, if he has said why he painted it, he adds it as well. Also, it will be about like who's in the painting, etc. And yeah, so for me, that experience it just hit somewhere really deep. I've never saw art as anything more than something pretty, or kind of something I didn't really get, something that wasn't useful even. But walking through these rooms, and yeah, I was just I was experiencing this person's life and what it was like to be them, and some parts I related with, and it's very powerful.
And this again, I'm going to stop prefacing it with this might be a silly question, but
there's no silly questions when it comes to art.
Okay, so this is a safe space. So
yes.
What made Egon Schiele so good? I know it's just one artist you're trying to show us, but what made him so good? Well,
yeah, that's quite a subjective question, but there's no doubt his work is still very powerful today. For me, there's a few reasons. One, visually, it's very arresting. It's very unique. From the second painting, you can tell. I've never really seen art like that. The way he drew himself, how the proportions, the shape, it was so bare. And basically no artist's paintings look like that. So that's one reason he stands out so much. Out of the millions and millions of artists that have ever painted or drawn or scribbled, sketched, whatever, his stands out. If I see a painting of him, I know it's him.
Because I'm just relating it to classical music, and I can say that a certain composer is really good for two different reasons. I could say one, they were good for their technique, and that they changed how music is played, and they brought something new to the world of music. Or I might love them because I love how they make me feel and how they express themselves, and they may not be as impressive as a musician, but I love the stories they tell. And I'm wondering, does that sort of apply in the same way to this sort of circumstance?
I agree. I was just getting to it. So obviously his stuff is very unique, but that's not all there is to being a good artist. Like, I could do something really weird. I don't know, just really strange, but that wouldn't necessarily make me a good artist or someone worth remembering. So what I find so special about him is so some art, especially with him, let me think of how to phrase it, and maybe edit this bit out when I'm thinking about it. So you mentioned the feeling you get when you listen to that song and you like it.
Yeah.
I think the feeling one gets when they look at their paintings, it's something quite different as well. So he's made thousands and thousands of self-portraits. He's obsessed with his own image. And, the way he depicts himself, it's not glamorous in the slightest. He doesn't make himself look handsome or, powerful or anything like that. It's so raw. It's real. It's what he sees in him. And often they're naked. It's completely vulnerable.
So personal.
Yes. And he has like I mentioned, he's a very obsessive person. So his main muse was himself, but his second was women. He loved women, and he would paint all different kinds of women, also often in compromising positions or nude, and in very specific ways, and the way he sees them. And that kind of obsession being laid bare, and it's hard to put into words, but I think there really is just no one like him.
Is he? Do you mind me asking if he's one of your favourites, or?
Yes, he definitely is,
Okay.
and a big reason is how much he influenced later on.
Okay.
How?
And is there a particular style that of art that he produces? Is there a name for that? Because you mentioned it's quite unique. Is there a name for that type of art?
Well, it's not too easily boxed, but some would say he's expressionism. So damning is kind of art that's about capturing, not necessarily what you see and representational, but capturing a concept or a feeling. Now, I thought he was very good at doing that. So also I don't want to talk just about Egon Schiele, even though I love him so much. Anything you feel about seeing his paintings, Saban?
You see, so this is the kind of stuff I'd maybe see in the museum or just see people talking about when they refer to art. And for me personally, it's just something I've just never really seen much, just much substance in it for me, in terms of the fact that I guess, I didn't create it, so I don't know where they were coming from. I understand where you were coming from with these series of paintings, and I guess the way that museum was structured, in the fact that it was all one person, so you could see the progression. So I think that has a lot more meaning to it, and I can definitely see it in these three images in these three paintings you showed. But in general, if I was just to see one of them, just straight up, I just wouldn't know what to think. I'm like, okay, that's interesting. And I guess I have the same thing with photography or video as well. But for some reason, I just have a lot more appreciation for it. I don't know why. Because I guess technically speaking, it's probably it's probably harder to paint something like this. But whereas, say with say with photography, I guess you're taking a camera and you're just hitting a button and then you capture that one image. Obviously, there's a lot of skill in terms of composition, lighting and everything. But, having to do each stroke by hand is a very different matter in terms of technicality, I guess. But yeah, so I can appreciate that side of it. Especially, there are some artists who do, those really hyper-realistic paintings and stuff, either portraits or just of objects. And I'll just look at that and I'm like, wow, that's so, like, the amount of skill they have. And
it's funny you say that. That's actually my least favorite kind of art, probably. The ones that are very hyper-realistic. And the reason is, if I want to see exactly what something is like, I just take a photo of it, probably. Something that's hyper-realistic, I feel like often it doesn't tell me anything. And I think for me, good art is meant to, it's not just, it shouldn't just be a recording of a thing. It should be, there should be something infused into it. But sorry, I interrupted you.
I was just can I interject a second time with the joke? It's just, I can imagine when cameras came out, I bet the hyper-realistic artists were scared. We're coming, our job is disappearing.
Anyway, taken by AI, basically. I understand there's not really much to it, but what I can appreciate is the absolute skill required in it and the attention to detail. And obviously it's the same kind of skill set, applied in a different way with these more, say, expressionistic kind of drawings. But because I'm not the one directly expressing it, for some reason I just find it really difficult to relate to it, which is why I probably never really appreciated it. But say with something with like photography, and you can get pretty abstract, say, street photography style photos. For some reason, I can still relate to it and still kind of appreciate it in the more expressionistic kind of way, because I don't know why. I guess one of the reasons why is because I can, kind of encapsulate or, imagine in my head the process behind taking it, what they went through to create that photo, or say the kind of environment they were in. Why I don't really get that with paintings and stuff, I don't know. But I can definitely, I like how you went through the progression, because I definitely gained a lot more from that. Whereas if I was just to see a singular one in isolation, I'd probably be okay, nice.
That's fair. Yeah, I guess how you want to approach art, and it's kind of like a spectrum. On one end, it's just you. It's just how it makes you feel. It's just how you project your own feelings and what you think of things onto it. And on the other end, when it's solely what the artist intended, it's solely what's on there. And let me think of, say. This is not really related, but something else I thought of is so there's a quote about art that I quite like, and I think kind of relates to this conversation. It's that art is not a thing, it is a way. So it's kind of a medium of expressing and and kind of and expressing our emotion, expressing concepts. But it's not the end all and be all. There's ways like photography, there's ways like music. And I don't necessarily think these are mutually exclusive from each other. I think the way when you see a photo that you really relate with, that really hits you, I don't think that process is separate from if another person sees art and they really relate with it and it really hits them. I think it's kind of, because at the end of the day, they're visual stimulation, and that's that someone, another person, has created or manufactured, and it's causing a change inside our brains. That brings me to another thing I wanted to talk about. Visual art in particular, I think, is actually very special. So obviously when you talk about art, it can mean kind of painting, it can mean music, it can mean so many different kinds of things. But for me, I think a reason that visual art is so powerful, so this isn't just my opinion, it's anatomy of the brain. So the cerebral cortex in the brain, it's kind of like the main part of, that defines us, who we are, how we perceive the world, how we think. So the main part of our brain, there's like the front bit, the frontal lobes, and there's like the parietal, temporal, there's occipital, there's 4 main parts. And one whole part of it is dedicated to just vision, the occipital part at the back. So of the entire cerebral cortex, about 20% is just for vision and interpreting it. And if you also count the areas that integrate visual information, so for example, combining visual and touch, like hand-eye coordination, or combining vision and emotion together, if you count all of these together, that takes up over half of our brain, about 60%. So we're so wired to interpret images, to process them, to perceive them, to draw conclusions from them. That's part of why I think, visual art is something that can be innate to us. We're literally wired to do it. And primates who have brains like us, like monkeys, and they can paint as well. It's quite funny, and they learn. They get better at painting.
Wow.
They're better at containing the paint on the paper. They're better at mixing colors that look good together.
I saw an elephant painting on Facebook recently.
Yeah.
I don't know. I know they're not like monkeys, but
Yeah. Well, elephants actually, many of them have more neurons than we do. They also have a cerebral cortex and such.
So in the cerebral cortex, so you're saying that we're kind of wired to take in so much visual information that if we can see art, we can take so much from it. Like it comes naturally to us.
Yeah, and it's not even an if, it's just a fact. Our brain is wired to process and understand and draw conclusions from visual information for all of time, for as long as Homo sapiens have been around. So Saban, when you're when you take photos, when you look at photos, so that process happening in your brain where you're processing it, appreciating it, that's wired in you, and it's a similar process with paintings. But I guess then it just comes to kind of taste about what you prefer, and that's shaped by our environment.
I think something that I would really like to get more from art, and for me it's a matter of exposure, because I haven't seen much art, so I don't know enough about it. I haven't had enough experience to know which artists I like, for example. What I really like with music is if I listen to a composer where I really identify with an emotion that I think they're trying to express, and I share that feeling that they're making in their music, I really it just really resonates with me. I wonder, I'm sure that must happen as well in art, like a perception of a person when you're in love or when you're really angry, and how it changes how you see them. And you can express that in art, but you can't do that when you're taking a photo. That seems like, to me, something that you can achieve with art, which is quite unique. I think you can achieve it with music as well, but with art, it's so in your face. Like, if it's about perception of someone who you're in love with, in music you can tell that story, but you need a bit of context. But I can imagine how in art you're seeing the person, even if you don't know anything behind it, you can see what they're trying to express because there's so much information to take in. So I can imagine that's really nice.
Yes, definitely. And so trying to separate music with visual art, and it's a fool's endeavor in some ways, because the basic concept is the same. It's modes of expression, or modes of expression, and the big difference is the type of stimuli you're using, the sense that you're expressing it through. One is through hearing, of course, and the other is through vision. But the basic concept, like you said, when you hear a song that you feel like, oh, this is so me, I relate to it, understand it, that's the same as in art. And I noticed you mentioned, you said what you want from art, and that's quite an interesting concept as well, because, so art is pretty universal, and we sometimes use it to make a mark, to prove our existence in a way, but is it actually useful in an everyday sense? That's something a lot of people ask. That's something, that's when I was younger thought as well, like art isn't very useful. It doesn't nourish me, it doesn't physically change my life, but in some ways I think it actually really does. Everything you see that's man-made has been specifically designed with visual parameters in mind. Even back, I'm going back to the cavemen again, the ancestors, because I think this really helps show a point that even though our world is so much different to theirs, finding common ground between us, it shows that's whether something is truly universal or not. But anyway, so a lot of kind of tools, such as hunting tools or kind of stones, that we find from fossils, that our ancestors used as tools for foraging, for hunting, we can find that, because they shape them. They don't just pick up a rock and use it. They would try to make a rock sharper. They would try to kind of make it a certain shape to make certain actions more easily. Oftentimes we find out these tools that they've fashioned, they're often symmetrical and in quite an aesthetic shape. And there's also research done into it, why they do it like that. And there's no practical reason. There's no reason for, a sharp thing used to kill a bear for it to be symmetrical. There's no reason for that. They spent the extra time and the effort into it just because they thought it looked nice. It was aesthetic. And really, aesthetic, it's actually a big part of how we even survive in this world. Being able to see patterns visually, for example, seeing whether a plant, because often when you see a plant with a symmetrical knot, can tell you whether it's okay to eat, for example, or if you're in a partner, if their face is quite symmetrical, that can be an indicator of them having not good genes and being able to produce healthy offspring. Just in so many things, aesthetic comes into it. So it's natural to us to seek out or create good aesthetic. And there's been studies shown that aesthetic surroundings, and it can actually improve our cognitive function and our mood. And also, by the way, when I say the scientific stuff, I can send you guys the papers afterwards if you want to.
We'll put it in the show notes. Yeah.
It's not just my opinion.
There are scientific studies that have been done by myself.
By me, yes. Yeah, and also, so obviously we're all medics, so I'll give a medical example. In Wales recently, there was a study done on kind of patient healing times it takes for a patient to be well enough to leave a ward in kind of older wards and hospitals versus newly refurbished wards, and everything else equal. The wards and hospitals that were more aesthetic, had more paintings on there, etc., more nicely designed, patients often took less time to heal and leave it. Just things like that, and it's almost healing.
Just like how it makes you feel, like it's satisfying and it's more
exactly.
calming.
Yeah.
And that can be a direct impact on your daily life.
It can be a direct impact even if you don't notice it. And many times you will notice it, such as if a road sign is well designed, or if things like that. Just building on to what I said about the aesthetic making us feel nice. There's a few other studies. I'll quote one more. There's one study that kind of measured skin responses of people responding to seeing buildings that are either like really kind of what's the word? You know those old concrete buildings that just came up 100 at a time back when all the countries were poor, so we built to house people. When they looked at that compared to when they looked at really nicely designed newer buildings, and when people looked at these older buildings that were less aesthetic, that had a lot less detail to them, they were more anxious. You can see by their skin response, by their heart rate response. And, as you know, anxiety over a long term is bad for your heart, it's bad for your brain. It's very interesting.
But then, so why is there so much art that is designed to make you feel uncomfortable as well?
That's a really good question. And the answer is because art isn't monolithic. It's not just it doesn't just have to be beautiful. Justin and I mainly talked about kind of beauty and aesthetics, but art doesn't equate good aesthetics necessarily. It doesn't have to be symmetrical. It doesn't have to be nice forms or good penmanship. It doesn't have to be that. So someone that can find disturbing art can enjoy it. Could be someone who relates to it. Someone who is also disturbed in themselves, but seeing disturbed art that they can relate with can make them feel less alone. It can make them feel like someone else understands it as well.
And then, if we're talking about how art makes someone else feel, I'm imagining if I were an incredible artist, do you think it's better for an artist to be worried about how it's going to affect the audience, or do you think the great artists do it for themselves and they don't think about how the audience is going to interpret it? Because I've always thought, again, relating it back to music, that the best musicians are the ones who are making that music for themselves. They're not doing it with the aim of anyone else involved in that.
That's a really good question. And I think in general, it is often that if you look at the famous artists, such as, let's take Van Gogh, for example. He's probably one of the, if not the most prominent artist today, as in the most celebrated. And his art was completely for himself. He loved painting. He loved nothing else but painting. He was a very disturbed man, as you probably know, lots of mental disorder and hardship, had to go to an asylum, fell on poor times. But art just kept him going. For him, art was his life. He thought he was put on this world to create art. So I think if you look at the stories behind great artists, you'll find that often it is kind of from themselves, for themselves. But at the same time, I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. Just because the art comes from yourself and is for you, doesn't mean it can't also be for other people. Or you can't think about others when you're creating it.
I think that's the beautiful thing about output, that you are sharing it with other people, regardless of whether you want to be doing that. You can make something for yourself and still share it with everyone else. I really like that. And then, sorry, you continue. Sorry.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's not a straight line. It's not from artist to viewer. It's not like that. I think it's a cycle with lots of circles within it, because the artist, where he gets kind of the emotions or the experience he has to create the art, that comes from other people. That comes from the culture he lived in. That comes from the events that happened to him, which came from other people. And then he transfers that into art, and then that goes back in as well, and that affects other people's experience. So you shouldn't ever think of it as like a straight line from one person to another. No, it's a constantly going around and around and around. And
then how about okay, this is actually really interesting. I've got a few questions.
You love prefacing.
Yeah, I'm prefacing everything. So sometimes I get into a debate with someone about whether they want to, with music, some people don't like to know anything about the band, and they don't like to know anything about what the song's really about, because they want to interpret it themselves. And even if that's nothing to do with what the song's about, they attach a meaning to that song that the artist didn't intend, but it's the composer or the songwriter didn't intend. With art as well, I can imagine there's always a context behind why they did a piece of artwork. Do you sometimes like not knowing why an artist painted something, and you get your own meaning from it, which is probably very different to why the artist produced it, but you've taken it on for yourself now. It means something personal to you and you don't want to know what it's about, do you think context is always important when you look at art, or do you avoid it sometimes?
Well, again, there's like a spectrum, like I mentioned before. On one side is solely your interpretation of it, and on the other side is the artist's intention behind it. And so many things can affect when you see a piece where on that spectrum you are. It could be the type of art it is. For example, if the art is very photorealistic, for example, then there's probably not too much of yourself, of your interpretation you can put into it. Then in that case, it's almost solely what the artist intended. But if something is very abstract, like a Rothko or what's his name again? Or a Pollock. So in those cases, it's almost completely just you, because they're just swathes of color or dots, and you put yourself into it. It's kind of like not a blank canvas, but something like that, as in there's something there for you to infuse yourself into. And so there's definitely some cases where it's easier for you to do one or the other. But I think if you try to only do it one way, I think you'll be losing out. Because if you look at any piece of art and you only think about what the author intended, if you only look at kind of their circumstance and why they did it, and then you're missing out on a potential greater connection between you and that. It's like, for example, when you love a person, you're not just we're getting onto love now, but I feel like with true love, big topics, it's not just what you like in a person. It's not just, the way their face is or the things they do. Often what you love is what's between you, kind of how they make you feel, or your connection, how you interact with each other. And so I think that applies maybe not as much of art, but definitely to a really large extent, in that, by just focusing on one side of it, you're losing out on the other part. And same goes the other way. If it's only just your interpretation of it, then you're missing out so much too, and it works both ways.
That is amazing. It's amazing how you can just spend your whole life making art and telling a story about yourself, and then you can have a parallel person doing the exact same thing about their life, and the ways they express themselves are completely different. That's so fast. Like what you're saying about Jackson Pollock, and then you've got someone who does very realistic art, and they both might be telling a similar event like love completely differently. That is really fascinating.
Yeah, if you ask Schiller to draw art, it would be so different to, for example, if you ask maybe Da Vinci to draw art.
Wow. Yeah.
Completely different.
And their techniques and everything must just be completely different, the way they interpret it. That's really cool. You need to send me like a big Google Drive of just some really good artists.
Yeah, sure, I could do that.
And there's one other question before we go to the next topic.
Okay.
So art is very universal, right? Like it's all around the world.
Yes, all around the world and all through the time, yeah.
Okay. Do you think, from your understanding, there are any cultures which rely on art more than other cultures, or certain religions which rely on art, and it means it's a bigger part of their culture than other parts of the world? Or?
That's an interesting question. Well, it's not a simple yes or no answer. Well, something that immediately comes to mind. So this interaction between culture and art. As you probably know, a lot of art, especially older art, is religion related. So lots of the most famous classical Italian art is all like Jesus on a cross, or Virgin Mary. And you probably, if I tell you think of Hindu art, you probably think of those statues of with lots of hands, or like Ganesh, etc. And there's Buddhist art. You can think of the monks, for example. Something really interesting is Islamic art. If I tell you Islamic art, what do you think of?
To me, do you mind if I answer it before you, Saban?
Yeah, go ahead.
So to me, when I think of Islamic art, possibly like calligraphy, a lot of like.
Definitely. What do you think, Saban?
Yeah, calligraphy is always one that is, I guess, has a strong identity with Islam, especially the Arabic, Quranic calligraphy and whatnot. Another aspect that I see a lot in Islamic art is a lot just with shapes and geometry, and architecture. So at least that's just from my experience, just seeing it around. Because if you think about the Ottoman empires and stuff, there's some of the architecture done in those days and stuff. It was extremely artistic in every way, and even just down to various geometry and stuff. I guess just simply with algebra and stuff like that being rooted from Islamic backgrounds, or by Islamic scholars back however long ago. I guess it just kind of makes sense, especially with, and then the whole aspect of astronomy and everything. I guess that in itself is an art to an extent. So that's kind of my take on it.
I agree. The calligraphy, the shapes, design, putting maps into it, that's a massive part of Islamic art, and it's beautiful. But we noticed that we didn't really talk about representation like people. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason that, do you know why, Saban? That calligraphy and such is so prominent, yeah?
Well, yeah, because, I assume you're going to say that, we can't draw people. So there's, I'm not a scholar, obviously, in Islam. And obviously there are a lot of, very big one. So obviously take everything I say with a pinch of salt. But I guess in general, at least from my understanding and whatnot, you're not allowed to, do figurative representation of things with souls, most importantly humans. So I guess that's why, I guess you'd get a lot of the Islamic artists of the time going back onto the calligraphy or geometry and shapes, or, nature and landscape and more inanimate objects and art with that. The reason for not being allowed to do paintings and stuff or representations of humans stems from the fact that obviously there are certain narrations and proofs that kind of go behind it, but I guess the fundamental wisdom behind why you're not allowed to do that in Islam is because of the risk of going into idolatry and worship of something other than God, which is haram by definition in any way, no matter how it kind of manifests. You're just not allowed to do that. It's the greatest sin. So that's why, especially when it comes to prophets and whatnot, that's why I was particularly, I guess that's kind of probably one of the main things it kind of stemmed from, was you don't want to have images or kind of representations of prophets, because people might unwillingly, and then eventually will kind of lead on a slippery slope, start worshipping that representation of them, which is a particular thing within, say, Hinduism, say with the idols and stuff they have. Similar in Christianity, where I don't know too much about Christianity, but say with the Trinity and Jesus and whatnot, and then Jesus being partly worshipped as well as part of the Trinity. So that was kind of a protection against that, and to prevent kind of any risk against that, I guess. There are going to be
Islam still found a way to produce art though, and like a complex expression of art, just a lot like with the rules that they have.
Yeah. As you can see. Yeah, thanks for such a detailed response, Saban. Yeah, you definitely know more about this aspect than I do. But yeah, so that's a good example for you, Dan, when you asked about the way society and art intersects. So within that whole society, it was essentially kind of forbidden to do representational art. And another reason that I read, I'm not sure if this is right or not, but I read that a reason that it was banned is because, creating images and representations, that's meant to be the job of God and God alone. No one else is supposed to be allowed to do that, or kind of that's not our role in Islam.
I haven't heard that specifically, but it does make logical sense. Where, say, especially with humans, because we were crafted or designed in such a way, if you're following certain theological beliefs, that you don't want to this can start getting really weird and really deep. So just manipulating self and our images, that's haram. That's why Muslims aren't allowed to get tattoos and whatnot. You're not allowed to do major surgeries just for beautification purposes. Obviously, if you want to get a rhinoplasty because you're having breathing problems, that's a different matter because it's a medical issue. But you can't just it's at least heavily frowned upon for just doing it for beautification and stuff, because we believe we were produced in the most perfect way for ourselves. And I guess, say if you're doing a self-portrait, but you want to beautify yourself in a particular way, now, you're now kind of putting your wants and your beliefs above God's, right? God wanted you to be in this way. So now you're drawing yourself, say if it's a self-portrait, I'm going to make myself more muscly or want to make myself taller. Now I'm just kind of inflating my own, say, ego or self in terms of what I want, and what I want is more than what God has given me, right? So this is kind of going into a self-worship almost now, and then that's kind of a slippery slope you can kind of get into. But yeah, I guess that's a whole designer kind of thing. There's a graphical designer called Chris Do, and he wears a hat where it says God is a designer, and I quite like that. And I guess it's true. If you believe that God has made every single thing on this planet, then he very much is a designer. But then, yeah,
just really quickly, that makes sense though, and that makes sense to me with like making yourself seem taller or more muscular. You can change how God made you by putting yourself in art. But what if, for example, you were just a few hundred years ago, this probably sounds silly, but you wanted to show a family member what your son looked like, and say you were an incredible artist yourself. What if you just did, with the intention of making it completely realistic, you painted your son, and then you showed it to that family member who never met him, so they could see what he looked like. But as I said, you were really good at hyper realistic art, and you didn't exaggerate any aspect of his appearance.
Yeah.
What would you say about that? Just in your opinion. So not applying it to the religion, but in your opinion.
Yeah, the thing is, I try to keep my opinions within lining of the religion. So, okay, so this becomes into like, it starts getting into grey areas and stuff. And obviously, again, I'm not a scholar, so what I'm saying is just from my kind of logical reasoning in terms of what I think would be, logical within the religion. I would still refrain from it, and I guess it was still forbidden anyway. The reason for that being is that no matter, I guess, if you're doing it hand painting, like, there is only so much detail and only so exact as to how you can make it. Even if you are, super hyper realistic, there's still going to be some kind of individuality presented within that. Because if you take two hyper realistic artists, they won't produce the exact same thing. But this is where the slight difference comes in, where, photography and portraits, like portrait photography is allowed because it's, scientifically an exact capture of what you were seeing. Now, obviously, if you start going in and photoshopping everything,
I was about to ask
that. Now you're just kind of defeating that whole purpose. Islam is very against, vanity and that kind of stuff in general. So, yeah. Now there are other things where, okay, so you can take a photo of someone, and because it's an exact capture, and if you leave it like that, then that can be used for, references and stuff. References as in, this is what, my great-grandchild looked like or something. If it was a photo, and that's, fine. Some scholars still do argue that is still not allowed. Now, obviously, there's a difference of opinion here. So, yeah. And I guess there's a bigger issue where hanging even photos of people on a wall is still... That's still a grey area as well. There are differences of opinion there as well. Some say you can, some say you can't. Again, the kind of wisdom behind... Well, so there's a narration saying where if there is a house... This isn't word for word, but it's along these kind of lines where... I'll reference the actual narration in the show notes. Basically saying, an angel won't enter the house... And angels won't enter a house where there are, paintings or images of people and dogs as well. So obviously, dogs is a different topic altogether. But yeah, again, I guess it's kind of it's like a precautionary step to prevent any kind of idolatry, even if it's unintentional at first. If you hang a particular person on a wall, maybe it's just someone who means a lot to you. It could lead to stuff. Obviously, it depends, but I guess it's better to be safer than sorry. So, that's kind of the take on it to a certain extent.
And maybe that kind of environment, like that attitude towards art, maybe that's the reason for the way you interpret art today, and maybe why you're more open to photography. But I don't want to get Freudian or anything. But yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? It is.
Yeah, I think that. So, I mean, I've never really looked at it in that kind of way, or maybe that probably has shaped how I kind of look at art. But the thing is, in terms of the Islamic aspect, I never really put that into my kind of field of vision until a few years ago, like 3-4 years ago, before that, I just didn't really, have much knowledge about it and whatnot. And back then, I didn't really, think too much of art in general, although I did think a lot about photography. But even then, a lot of my, what I find aesthetically pleasing, is just a lot of geometry and shapes. Like, especially like, have you ever seen like Kufi style Arabic calligraphy? It's very like blocky and geometric and stuff rather than the, classic fluid type. I really like that, even though I cannot read it whatsoever.
You've always liked that sort of stuff for years, though, I would say.
I have.
Even at school, you liked it always.
Yeah, I don't know why. I've always liked that kind of geometry. Whether it's just because, it probably has partly to do with my upbringing and whatnot. It's not that I've never seen portraits or anything, or never been, or been shunned away from seeing portraits and stuff. But I guess when I see things of like, certain, everyone likes a sunset photo, but yeah, I guess when it comes to, like, I guess you'll see on my Instagram and say when I take photos of I really like taking photos of buildings, just because of the geometry involved in looking at it. yeah, at Sabanda. Links in the show notes. So yeah, I really like taking photos of buildings from really weird geometric angles, or even just really simple buildings from angles you wouldn't usually see. I don't know. It just suits my brain, I guess. I do enjoy it.
That makes sense, yeah.
Yeah.
Another takeaway from what we were just talking about, it's a bit silly, but I guess in some ways in Islam, they almost interpret, if you do sort of kind of art like you're playing God. It's quite interesting to think about. Every time you sit down and you draw a face, or if you generate something or manipulate images in such a way that isn't realistic, in a way, I guess you are playing God. You're creating something that's never been there before. Yeah, that's sure to make a few of my friends who are in art school feel a bit better about themselves. Okay. Another thing I thought of, I should have mentioned while we were talking about the effect beauty has on kind of your health, your cognition and your mood, is there's a really interesting field in medicine about art therapy. And so now this isn't just kind of experiencing art around you, it's physically doing it, like painting or doing music. So we're finding out there's been more and more studies about art therapy and its effects on people who are ill. And we find that reliably in even randomized trials, so like the gold standard, we find that art often reliably improves mood, improves cognition in patients with diseases like schizophrenia, with depression. It even helps improve pain in patients with dementia. There is something so powerful about it. And that's a field I'm really interested in.
I remember working in a nursing home, and sometimes about 80 to 90% of the residents had dementia, and every week on a Thursday afternoon they would sit down, people who wanted to would come downstairs and sit down and draw, and almost every single time they would leave the room in a better mood and in a better state than when they came in. I know that's completely anecdotal, but yeah, that's really interesting.
It's true. Again, ties in, I guess the main message that I keep talking about during this podcast is just, how in some ways innate it is. And no matter if it's subconsciously or consciously, it's, so that leads into maybe the final quote I want to say. I don't know where it's from, I just saw it somewhere years ago. So the quote is, art is, and that's it. Art is.
Is.
Yeah, so as long as we exist, there will also be art. And, it will always be there. From tens of thousands of years ago in caveman paintings to today, you see it in museums, you see it, it's just everywhere. And so I think everyone should explore it, or they'll be missing out of it.
Do you think it's something everyone should take the time to do?
Well, that was a bit of a strong word. Not should. Also, at the same time, I don't think it's really your choice in it, because we know how prevalent art is every day around us. Even if you don't want to, you're actively engaging in it. Whenever you see even a sign in the underground, they've all been meticulously designed for both aesthetic reason and for utilitarian reasons. Whatever clothes you wear, some artistic thought has gone into it. So you'll be interacting with it whether you like it or not.
I get what you mean.
But you can choose to try to form a deeper connection to it, which almost certainly anyone is capable of. as we've talked about.
Because every decision you make, you're expressing yourself, and then it affects how other people perceive you. I do get what you mean, I think. Even in like how you're dressing, you are making a statement whatever you do. Is that right? Or
Well, I guess that's one way you can look at it. What I mean is kind of, it's not just the act of doing. You don't have to do more art. That's not what I'm saying. But kind of opening yourself to be able to have more of a connection to it, whether it leads to you doing it or not.
do you think anyone can form a deep connection with art? Or do you think there are people who literally you don't think they would ever form a deep connection with it? Do you think if someone's exposed to enough of it and the right art for them, they could form a deep connection with it?
I would say 100%. As long as your brain isn't abnormal, as long as you have, the visual cortex, as long as you have the emotion part, the limbic lobe, etc. As long as you have that, there is, because the tools are there and the hard drive is there.
Last time I checked, I do have a visual cortex, so that means...
You're seeing me right now? Yeah.
So what if there's a person who's blind since birth, but then obviously they can visually see with touch and stuff?
That's a great question.
I mean, I didn't really ask a question, but yeah, I was implying a question. Yeah, what happens then?
That's really interesting. That makes me think of something else I learned a few years ago. Basically, I was wondering whether blind people dream. People who are blind dream. And so I looked it up. And apparently, if you have been blind since birth, then you don't dream in things you see. You dream in voices. So you don't dream of seeing anything. But if you've been blind after some time, so halfway through life, then you do see in your dreams. So I guess maybe for people who are blind, again, art doesn't just have to be visual. For them, art serves the same thing, but maybe musically, maybe by touch, as you said.
Have you read the book called The Aesthetic Brain?
No, I have not. But I think I've seen it in like Waterstones.
Yeah,
definitely.
I mean, I haven't read it either. I was asking if you've read it just in case. So the author Anjan Chatterjee, I think, he did a TED talk a few years ago about brain and aesthetics and stuff, and basically since then I put the book on my reading list, but I haven't got around to reading it yet. But now I do really want to read it really soon. And it goes on about why we find certain things really nice, and I guess there are some things that are universally people just like nice, like it's just nice, like aesthetically
definitely
pleasing. Why
no
that
language
is,
to it.
yeah, exactly. And
it's a language in itself.
and why people have just been doing it for so long, why we find certain faces beautiful, some not so, even on a somewhat universal scale. How is it that despite developing in different countries or different places of the world, different experiences, different landscapes, we still kind of almost have this innate unified appreciation for things like symmetry, certain aesthetics, certain even sounds, and like certain sounds are just really satisfying, or just certain clicks. Everyone seems to have that kind of innate stuff, and I think the book kind of goes into that, so you might find it quite interesting. I mean,
I'll take
hopefully
a look.
I will as well, but yeah, just a recommendation even though I haven't read it.
And something I'm definitely going to take from this episode, I'm going to take more time to learn a little bit more about a few different artists and maybe a few different areas of art. And then that last quote you mentioned, I really like that. I will think about it a bit later on, but I think that's a really nice quote. Art is.
Art is.
Okay.
And you can add anything you want to the end of it, and it wouldn't be wrong.
I'm going to keep repeating it to myself in my sleep.
Okay.
Art is. But yeah, thank you very, very much for that, Jerry.
No worries.
Very insightful. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Subhan?
No, I think it was a pretty interesting discussion overall.
Yeah, and again, just thank you for coming on, Jerry.
No worries.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah, nice to talk to you, both of you.
Thank you very much.
Oh.
Okay, well, with that, I guess we can leave it. We always end our episodes in the same way. You mentioned you don't sometimes watch our episodes completely, so we'll both do our typical exit, and then you can exit as well. So thank you very much, and peace.
Oh yeah, just really quickly. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, man.
Okay,
I'm
well,
taking
I've
over.
already pieced,
I'm taking
so
over.
you can continue if you'd like.
Yeah, just because I talk so much about art, but maybe someone might be interested in the kind of art I do. So I specifically love people. I love drawing people. Islam wouldn't be too happy about that, maybe. I love people. And if you guys want to check it out, I'm not doing it too much recently, but I have a little Instagram, jerry.yi.art. So if you're interested. I'm not professional or anything, but I do very much like it. Cool.
And we'll link it down in the show notes as well.
Nice.
Okay, I'll give this one more go, okay?
All right, take two.
So, take two. Thank you very much, Jerry. Everyone, don't forget to check out Jerry's Instagram if you're interested. And with that, I leave it with a peace.
Peace.
Peace?
Yeah, nice. Thank you for listening to this episode of Getting It.
If you enjoyed this episode,
or didn't,
then feel free to leave us a rating and review on the Apple Podcasts app or on the Apple Podcasts website.
We'd love to hear your thoughts, ideas, or questions about anything we discussed, so feel free to email us at thoughts@gettingit.co.uk.
You can also reach us on Twitter or Instagram at gettingit_pod.
You can find all the links in the show notes.